stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Is my microphone switched on? Yeah, it is. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the SS Rotterdam. You'll be pleased to know that I had a word with the captain this morning, and I was reassured that the paintings you see here are not icebergs, in fact, and that while the humanity may have to change course, the ship will not. The ship will stay here, so we're in good shape. We have a wonderful panel, of course, Jorgen, who is author of this wonderful book, I must say, a very special book. Yolanda Kakabatze, an dear old friend who is president of the World Wildlife Fund. Sheila Murray, a newer friend who is on our executive committee at the Club of Rome. And Eberhard von Kerber, who is the chairman or the president of the Club of Rome, co-president with Ashok Khoshla. Let me say, Jorgen, that this is a remarkable book. It is an 80-year journey. That's roughly the lifespan of those of us who live in the rich world. It's an 80-year journey. And what I found compelling about it, and partly because it fits with my own sort of thinking about where the Club of Rome must go and must move, is that it combines the analytical, the intellectual, the systemic issues in a very, very forward-looking, analytical way, but it balances that by the heart, by the positivist look at our issues of values, beliefs. It's a personal journey as well as a professional journey. And I think that is, in some sense, a metaphor for where the Club of Rome needs to take the debate as we move forward. How do we marry our values, our beliefs, our understandings, our inner feelings about where our planet is going? Do we believe in the future? Do we believe in our children? But how do we combine that with the analytics, the use of tools that can help us determine a way forward? So I think the mix of values meeting valuation, the head meeting the heart, the normative marrying with the positive is actually an outstanding example in this book. And I must say I found it a compelling read, both as a personal journey by you, Jorgen, but also as a professional piece of work on the forecasting side as well. So I think that sets the stage, I hope, for an important discussion and debate, and I'm going to invite Jorgen to give us a presentation, and then my colleagues will say a few words afterwards. So Jorgen, you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ian. Those were very kind words, and I hope they are true. I'm now going to do something which cannot be done, which is to try to give a presentation of a 400-page book in 12 minutes, particularly since this book has endless number of facets. It's quite an interesting read, just like Ian said. Even I say this, having spent the last half year toiling with this horrible thing, you know, for most of my time. Hi, Peter. So I'll try to be quick and try to get you the essence in 12 minutes. First of all, the reason why I wrote this book was basically personal. I wanted to satisfy my curiosity about what kind of life conditions I am going to have during the remaining 20 to 25 years of my life. So this was, I've been worrying about the future most of my life. Now I wanted to have a description what the rest of my life is actually going to look like, so I can stop worrying and knowing. So that's completed. I know what the next 40 years is going to be like. And this gives great peace of heart. The second thing is that I have worked a lifetime pushing sustainability. And I'm now so old that I'm seeing that I did not succeed. You know, we have been working for 40 years trying to make the world a sustainable place, and it is not particularly much more sustainable now than it was 40 years ago. So the big question at the outset was the question, will the world overshoot and collapse? You know, this was the warning that my friends and I made in 1972 in the Limits to Growth book, where we basically said that because of the decision delays in international governance systems, you know, the world will be allowed to expand beyond its sustainable capacity, and then sooner or later it will be forced back down into sustainable territory, and this will be an unpleasant development, overshoot and collapse, caused by slow decision making in international systems. We're now 40 years down the line, and it is perfectly obvious that the world has already overshot. You know, at the time in 1972, our critics say that human society is not going to be so stupid as to let the world move into non-sustainable territory. Well, solidly, we now are in unsustainable territory. The simplest example is, of course, climate gas emissions that currently are twice the amount of what is being absorbed in the world's oceans and forests. And as warned in 1972, this is an effect of slow decision making even 20 years after the Rio meeting. You know, greenhouse gas emissions are growing faster than they did at the time of the meeting. So the question is, we are in unsustainable territory. Is it possible to ease back, you know, to get back into sustainable conditions through a soft landing? Or will the world collapse? And what does collapse mean? It basically means huge migration flows and destruction of society as we know it. We have been trying to achieve managed decline over the last 40 years. You know, people have been speaking about sustainable development, but it doesn't work. The human footprint is still going up in spite of all the talking. So the purpose of the 2052 book is basically to try to look at the next 40 years. What will happen? You know, not what should happen or what could happen, but what will happen. And how have I gone about trying to make such a forecast? No one else has tried to do this before. It's basically looking at the last 40 years of data and then understanding how decision making is being made in the world, and then seeing, you know, how this will add on the shoulders of history into a future development. And so I'm basically assuming the current systems of governance, you know, the democratic decision making that takes place in some parts of the world, the market decisions that are being made elsewhere, the much more centralized decision making which takes place in certain places with an overlay of international organizations. And I assume more or less a continued normal response to future problems. The world in the analysis is split in 5 regions. I treat the US as one, the OECD less the US, so the old industrial countries as a second category, China as a third category, BRICS, the 14 largest emerging economy, as the fourth one. I cannot use BRICS because the C in BRICS is already occupied in China, so that's why it's called BRICS. And then the rest of the world are the 140 other nations, essentially the poor part of the world. And I make a forecast for each of those regions, and then the world forecast is the sum of those 5. The main message of 2052 is that humanity won't make it. You know, we are not going to make a soft landing. We will basically run into an overshoot and collapse type of future, although it happens much later than most people think. And I'm now going to show, listen to me, don't worry about the graphs. You know, the graphs are there in order to impress you, you know, to show that there is a huge amount of quantitative work behind my very simple statement. Listen to what I'm saying, and that's the, so I'll go very quickly through the essentials of the forecast. I start with the global population. In my book, and follow the red curves. Is the, if you want to look at one curve, look at the red one. So the global population will peak around 8 billion people in 2040. This is much earlier and at a much lower level than most people think. The reason for this is the very rapid decline in fertility, in the desired family size, in urban situations, both in the poor and the rich world. The world GDP is going to, the economic activity of the surface is going to continue to grow, but it will grow much slower than most people think. The reason for this is that, first of all, a number of the world's economies are very mature, meaning that most of the activity is in the services and care sector, where productivity increase is very difficult. And so the rich countries are not going to grow very fast. And secondly, there is the problem that we will not experience economic takeoff in most of the poor world. You know, the emerging countries will probably do it, but not the others. So there will be GDP growth, but not as fast as most people think. And actually, the GDP of the world will peak around 2060, 2070. And then it will go down because the population is going down and because productivity is declining. Interestingly, over the next 40 years, human society is going to face a number of emerging problems: depletion, pollution, biodiversity decline, climate change, rising inequity, distributional differences. And the way society is going to handle those issues is to throw money at them. You know, when resources get scarce, they will gradually start to do something for substitutes. When pollution levels get too high, one will spend money trying to get them down, etc., etc. So the investment share of the GDP, that fraction of annual production which is not used for consumption, but is used to avoid or to improve world in the long run, will increase. And that means that the amount of consumption, the GDP which is available for consumption, will not grow as fast in the future as it would have done if we did not have to meet all those challenges of humanity. And disposable income, which is the per capita version of this, will stagnate, you know, and in some parts of the world, for instance the rich world, will actually decline over the next 40 years. It is no easy once you have the backbone to calculate what is the energy use of this economy, because we know that energy efficiency is going to gradually increase all along, so you just multiply with the GDP and you see that energy use, interestingly, will peak already in 2040. And if you multiply this curve with the carbon emissions per unit of energy, which is also something that will decline as we introduce more and more renewables over time, you see that global CO2 emissions will peak in 2030, and in 2050 they will be back down to current levels. This is, of course, a far cry from the current ambition of reducing CO2 emissions by 50 to 80% by 2050, which is what people say we need to do in order to keep temperatures under +2 degrees centigrade. So this means that we are actually in a situation where we're going to let CO2 emissions, annual emissions, be so high that when we get to 2050, you know, we are quickly moving towards global warming. I've asked my friends in the United States to calculate for me, you know, what is the temperature effect of my CO2 future. And in the next slide, you'll see that the global average temperature will pass +2 degrees centigrade in 2050, and will actually peak at +3 degrees centigrade in 2080, which is touch and go. It's just where you could fear that that self-reinforcing climate change takes hold. So, in other words, 2052 says that the world is on its path towards climate collapse in the second half of the 21st century. It doesn't happen before 2050, but it happens afterwards. In other words, can translate this now to, is that current systems of governance appear incapable of handling the climate challenge. That's another way of saying exactly the same thing. And thirdly, for those who are interested in how does this compare with Limits to Growth 1972, I'm saying that it's the pollution crisis from 1972 which is the most likely one. It is not the resource crisis, it's not the food crisis, it's not the water crisis, it's not those. It seems that it's the pollution emissions problem which is actually going to be the likely scenario. Why is this happening? The root cause of all of this is human short-termism. It is the fact that both capitalism and democracies are amazingly short-term in their decision-making. You know, humans do not want to sacrifice much today in order to get a benefit 30 years down the line. And capitalist systems do allocate money based on a discount rate which is so high that anything that happens beyond 5 years is close to invisible. And since those are the two major systems of governance in place, you know, the world will continue to react in a myopic fashion to the challenges, and the sum result is what I have described. Can short-termism be handled? The answer is yes in principle, but in practice it is very difficult because it probably means strong government, you know, that you basically delegate difficult decision making to supranational or centralist bodies like the central banks of the world. And the intense dislike of stronger government is, of course, something that which is going to preclude a sane solution to the problems. Let me very quickly give you a better flavor for what the next 40 years is going to look like. And I use graphs showing real disposable income per person in the 5 regions to illustrate this. So the first thing I'm saying is that humanity will try to grow its economy as fast as possible over the next 40 years. The problem is that they won't manage, you know, because of what I've said, because of inequity, because of productivity, slower growth rates in productivity. The unexpected benefit of the much smaller population and the much smaller GDP is, of course, that the human footprint becomes much smaller over the next 40 years than most people expect, which in turn pushes the crisis to the second part of the century. So there are huge advantages with the fact that the GDP is actually not going to grow as fast as everyone is trying to make it grow. The rich world will experience stagnation. In the forecast, the income of an American auto worker in Detroit in 2052 is even lower than it is today, you know, because the United States of America has huge problem with its foreign debt and a society which is totally incapable of handling the frictions between the classes in society, and consequently will not manage to get its act together. There are no resource constraints, there is nothing else, it's just a decision inability in that system. And it will basically end, as I said. One other reason why the human footprint will grow slowly and postpone the crisis until the second part of the century is the fact that 3 billion people will remain poor. You know, most forecasts assume that the poor people of the world, the bottom of the pyramid, will actually in some way or the other, you know, move towards Western standards or Chinese standards or Indian standards, you know, over the, not Indian, Western standards over the next 40 years. My answer is it won't. You know, we will have perhaps plus 2% a year, 3% a year growth in those economies, which from the small base doesn't lead to a lot. It doubles incomes, but it's still very low. So, and the footprint is low. Other resources in my book are not a problem. Water, food, and fossil fuels will be there in sufficient amounts. What does sufficient mean? It means that there is enough to deliver to those that can pay. So, to illustrate with the food situation, the world is capable of producing more than enough food for those that can buy food, and will not produce food for those that cannot pay. So the poor will not only be poor, they will be hungry because they cannot buy the food that the rest of the world could easily produce. Finally, I should say that the 2052 forecast covers a multitude of additional aspects. This is propaganda from the publisher. You know, we should make you aware of the fact that it's worth reading the book, because it talks about the split of the EU in the 2010s, it talks about how urban life will be in 2040s, it talks about the future of military and biodiversity, of CSR, and the fifth cultural step, and the future role of self-programming robots, which is really the interesting end to all of this. What should be done? 4 recommendations, and they're very obvious, but they are starting to take on some stronger importance, I think, now. First of all, we're back to the thing that have fewer children is one of the, try to further reduce the growth of the population. And of course, it's especially in the rich world where it's important to get the number of children down. My daughter has a footprint which is at least 10 times as big as an Indian daughter. And so, she's much more dangerous than an Indian. Secondly, reduce the ecological footprint, and particularly the footprint from people like I, or rich societies like Holland, because it's the footprint of those nations that need to be lowered, because everyone is aiming to be in that situation. And that means basically one thing: stop using fossil fuels. It's as simple as that. Thirdly, construct a modern, low-carbon energy system in the poor world, for the poor world, paid for by the rich world. This is the simplest fashion of development aid that we can do. Just start building the windmills and the solar plants and the gas with CCS, etc., plants that is actually going to produce relatively low-carbon energy for the third world. And finally, this is code. Strengthen the global ability to act fast in order to accelerate the effort to improve the living conditions for our grandchildren. In other words, we need to find a solution to the extreme short-termism in capitalism and in democracy in order to get in place a system which handles the long-term challenge. Needless to say, these things are hard to implement, and they're even harder if the distributional issues are allowed to deteriorate even further. So we need full employment, and we do need limited income disparities in order to be able to do these things. And both of those things may well lack in the future. Finally, what could the Club of Rome do? And the Club of Rome is, of course, one of those rare entities that is operating at a supranational level. And it should continue its tradition of asking unpopular questions and promoting unpopular solutions. These are among the few gentlemen that can actually say that there are limits to to liberal market democracies. In the case of 2052, it's basically 4 values to cite in that needs to be pushed. First of all, education and empowerment of women. This is one of the easier ways to get the population growth rate down. Then one need deep respect, even religious respect, for use of fossil fuel. One should not be using fossil fuels. That's a moral type of message. Thirdly, we do need governance systems fit for the challenges of the next 40 years, and those are not the challenges of the past. The challenge of the future is in the long term. It's to counter short-termism. And finally, the value of full employment and limited income disparity. Basically saying that redistribution of the proceeds of society is important and necessary in order to get everything else in place. And that's it. These are hard but worthy causes, and I'm sad to be the messenger. I don't like what I see. Please don't shoot the messenger.
We're going to have a round of comments, and then we will open up for questions and discussion. The next is Yolanda Kakabatsi, President of WWF. Yolanda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Jorgen. You've given us so much information and food for thought that it's difficult to react to most of what you have said, so I will just focus on those things that I find are relevant for WWF. And first of all, I would like to thank you and the Club of Rome for this partnership in building an agenda together today and tomorrow. That has made a tremendous and will make a tremendous difference to us in WWF, and I'm sure to you also in listening to our responses. WWF works at the global level and at the local level. And you have mentioned that governance, international governance is one of the major fields of inaction and potential reaction to what we are living. And we are working in international governments, sometimes in despair. When we look at what's happening now in the preparation for Rio+20, in the discussions this week and past week in New York, we cannot but despair. However, we keep pushing the agenda through several fronts, in the national governments, at the international meetings, be it wherever they take place. Because we believe that unless those individuals that we have elected through our governments to represent our countries in these global forums, unless they react in time, not much can happen in terms of building new agendas, new visionary agendas. I think the international governance is in charge of building the long-term vision for where we want to go. If at the national level our decision makers are concentrated in the short-term vision, then the international bodies should be looking much further ahead. But then, when you mentioned the numbers and you mentioned 2052, Jorgen, and what can happen, the good and the bad and the ugly, I ask myself whether El Salvador can be worse than it is today, or than it was in October. El Salvador in October received in 1 week more rain than the added rain of the last 10 years. Can it be worse? I mean, for that population in El Salvador, the end of the world is tomorrow. And we are talking about the next 50 years. So I think in what is fascinating about the information that you have given us, Jorgen, is that we have to put that information and adapt it to the realities of the different parts of the world. And be able to bring that information to the decision makers at the local level so that they can use that with salt and pepper according to what's happening at the local level. Then another area of action of WWF is working at the local level, working with the communities, working with women, working with the young people, working with those who are the real victims and vulnerable people to all these changes that are taking place now and that are predicted for the next 50 years, 40 years. So that is another one of the fields of work that we very much believe in. We work up here with international governance, but we have to create awareness and build the capacity to respond at the local level. And with that, I want to make it clear that we don't bring solutions. What we do is work with the local communities in order to make the solutions that they have more visible, to share them with other communities around the world where we have lessons to bring to other continents or countries. And maybe that is one of the failures at the national level and the international one, not recognizing that a lot of responses are already there and have done and have been there for decades or centuries. We are not a research organization, but we have the capacity to make new research visible as an instrument for change. And that is the other field where I believe we can make a contribution. However, there are certain technologies and research, and I'll mention one as an example. Barcelona was very happy a couple of years ago to be able to desalinize water in a crisis. And they managed. How am I going to bring desalinated water into Quito, 3,000 meters high and 500 kilometers away from the coast? So, research in technology, there are great steps forward, but we need to make it available and to think of the most vulnerable ones in terms of countries and regions of the world and population. In the last one, the last area that I would like to mention is national policy. We work with every single government around the world in order to facilitate information that would allow public policy to become a reality, to face the different threats. Sometimes it has to do with resource management, and other times it has to do with adaptation or mitigation of the impact of climate change or the management of biodiversity. It doesn't always work. If we look at what's happening in Brazil right now with the forest code, we wonder how much we can stop things or change things. But anyway, there is a permanent evolution in the work we do with national governments and decision makers, being absolutely certain that anyone can be a decision maker at any moment, and that we need to invest in that broader society so that they are prepared to act when their times come to be in the decision-making level. Those are some of the reactions I have to your points, Jorgen, and again, thank you for bringing this broad picture of the content of your book to us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. Let me turn to Sheila. Sheila Murray, you have the floor.
I'd like to start off by echoing Yolanda's comments in many of your comments, but I'll do that later. And I'd like to thank Jorgen for this great effort. And it really is a great effort because of the need to intimately know what has gone before and also what's happened to the projections made in Limits to Growth, and then provide us with options and a new platform, really, for action in 2052. Thank you, Jorgen. I've been given the task of speaking for the OECD countries, all 33 of them minus the United States. I'm from Canada, and we're one of the few Arctic countries, I guess, in the world, but certainly in the OECD. So I won't presume to know much about the other 32 countries, but I'll give it my best. To start off with, I'd like to refer to Jorgen's comment about footprint. I've done work for 10 years with Native peoples in Canada, the Upper Great Lakes group, the Woodland Indians as they are called. And one of the comments made was that Native Canadians, first of all, they should have had a very good system of registration and reservation to avoid all the contact with Europeans who came and, in their view, ruined the continent. However, they say that North America appeared to be empty when Europeans arrived because Native Canadians left no footprint. And we have a lot to learn from Native Canadians who do not see themselves as Native peoples around the world, not just Native Canadians, who do not see themselves as separate from ecological systems, but see themselves as part of. And that's really an important learning, I think, for all of us. In 2052, Jorgen defined, and we've seen the graphs of the countries, United States, OECD, minus United States, China, Bryce, and the rest of the world. I think the conclusions indicate that we need to be concerned in the OECD rich countries, that's minus the United States, about the rest of the world. That really is the message, that we have to deal with poverty, we have to deal with a climate-damaged world in order to make any progress. And I think in our contemporary society, we are experiencing the issues of poverty as people lose ground in terms of their status in the economic system in the OECD-rich countries. They also see the effects of climate change. I'll give you an example. I live in Ottawa in Canada. We have rarely used our gas-fired central heating since mid-March. We had 27 degrees temperature in mid-March in Ottawa. When I left Montreal yesterday, that was the same temperature. So we're experiencing, great changes in temperature. It could be 27 degrees in the midday, and it can be -5 at night. So that really causes a lot of damage, causes a lot of change. Now back to the report. I found the report, first and foremost, very readable. And I think that's really important, because we need to make sure we can convey the messages in that report to many, many people. And that's in the OECD countries, but it's also to the rest of the world. And so we have to be able to convey hope and not imminent disaster. We have to convert worn-out myths to what I call facing the music, or facing reality. We're in a reality situation now. We have to say, we know that doesn't work, so we have to forget about that. This is the new reality. I'm optimistic by nature, but I'm also an optimist, having read your report. I think the ideas are presented in a systematic, but it's also a systems and holistic thinking. In other words, the dots are connected. That's very difficult to do, because our education systems have enabled us to carve out silo sections of our learning, and to connect it all into a picture is really an art. And I believe 2052 is presented in that way. The dots are connected, and that's why it is really readable. I think, as I mentioned before, one of the things about this book is that it deals with trends, and that enables us, when we're trying to convey the message of poverty amidst plenty, increased climate turbulence, which I've spoken to, turbulence in the financial sector, job loss, stagnant growth, and all those other messages. We can use those graphs, and we can convey them in press releases, in other means of communication. This report also gives not only Jorgen's comments, but I think the rest of us, a legitimate platform to set the stage for the next 40 years and how to move forward. And I think, as Yolanda said, that has to be customized to the local community where the action is really going to happen. I was recently, I guess last week, at a conference, unfortunately titled the Sustainable Prosperity Conference, but in that conference there were mining, executives of mining companies in Canada, forestry, oil sands, other representatives of the extractive industries, and of course Canada is commodity-rich, energy-rich country. And one of the key messages out of that was that, and this was the head of research for the mining industry in Canada, he said, we've missed the boat. We've expended our social capital by being arrogant. We have said to people whose land we're exploiting, well, we know best, and so therefore we don't need to listen to you. And I think there's a recognition, and it's at a subnational level, it's at a business and industry level, that the values have to change. One of the other persons on this panel was a young Native woman from the Innu in Labrador. And she commented, she said, we have 30,000 years of science. And you are speaking from a platform of 30 years. So it's time we work together. One thing I found about your book, Jorgen, that is very interesting and I think quite appealing, that is you are challenging the reader by saying I have very low expectations. You're not going to be able to do it. Now, I find that both provocative and challenging. And maybe this is part of the message that we have to convey. Lower expectations, because decision-making is stagnant in the OECD countries, in the United States, certainly not in China. So we don't expect you'll be able to get around to making decisions to take action in all these issues. I guess I'm such an optimist and also stubborn that I see that as a real challenge. You also dealt with the values underpinning sustainable lifestyles. People understand now what a disorderly and climate-damaged world we live in and what it means. Lastly, I'd like to mention the book Collaborate or Perish. Some of you have probably read that. One of the authors, there are two authors, and one turned around the New York City police by a change in values, by a new platform for speaking, and also by using statistics. He used graphs, so it was a training education approach. And I think we need to start looking at that to induce behavioral change. We have the capacity in the OECD minus the US. We have the capacity to do things. We have the resources. We have the diversity. And we have the poverty, which is growing. And we know what climate change means. We need to change our investment priorities. We need to invest in reduction of poverty. I was glad to hear your comments on the role of the Club of Rome, because there are 5 priorities areas that are part of the communication strategy, and those priority areas focus on results. I think we can popularize the unpopular questions if we're careful with our communication strategy. We need to also educate and train our members at the international level and at the national levels through the 33 different organizations. We need to focus on value change, and we need to influence governments. What's happening in Canada is things are happening at the subnational level, happening at the mayor's level. A good example is the mayors of the Great Lakes. That's 11 states in the United States, 2 provinces in Canada, and they have a strategy to deal with the issues you've raised.